Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep into the world of probation in Georgia today.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at a recent case.
Okay.
It really shows how even little procedural things, in the justice system
Mm-hmm.
can have huge consequences. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's wild.
It's fascinating because it kind of gets to the heart of what probation is supposed to be about, right?
Yeah.
Rehabilitation, second chances, and ultimately, like, making sure everybody is safe and, the well-being of everyone involved.
Exactly. Yeah. And the case we're looking at is Clark v. the State,
Okay.
a ruling from the Georgia Supreme Court just last week, February 18th, 2025.
Wow, so fresh.
Super fresh. And this case really focuses on early termination of probation,
Okay.
which, sounds pretty simple, but
Yeah,
as we'll see, it can get kind of complicated.
absolutely. And what makes this case really, really interesting is, what happens when someone on probation is, like, doing everything right?
Right.
Meeting all the requirements, but then, like, the system itself is like throwing up roadblocks.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's get into it.
Okay.
The case is about this guy, Marvante Clark. Back in 2018, he pleaded guilty to a bunch of offenses: burglary, theft, drug violations, even obstructing an officer.
Wow.
Pretty serious stuff, right?
Yeah, that's a lot. It was definitely a lot of offenses, but the key is that he was sentenced as a first offender.
Okay.
So that means the court was like, all right, this guy, he's got potential for rehabilitation.
Gotcha. And that's really important in how his case went forward, right?
Absolutely. So Clark was sentenced to 1 year in confinement, followed by 9 years of probation. But here's where it gets interesting. A key thing, this behavioral incentive date, it wasn't on his sentencing order.
Whoa, whoa, wait. Behavioral incentive date. What is that and why is it so important?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a checkpoint, right?
Okay.
That determines when someone on probation, might be eligible for early termination. So think of it as like a target date, to potentially get off probation early based on, good behavior and fulfilling, the terms of your sentence.
Right.
In Georgia, the law, it's spelled out, it's in the Official Code of Georgia annotated, Section 17-10-1, subsection A, paragraph 1, subparagraph B, or OCGA Section 10-1-1B.
Oh my gosh, that's a mouthful. I can see why we call this a deep dive.
Yeah,
So this part of the law basically says that if that date, the behavioral incentive date, isn't specifically set by the judge,
right.
during sentencing, it automatically defaults to 3 years after the sentencing date?
You got it.
Okay.
And so in Clark's case, that means he potentially qualified for early termination back on February 12th, 2021,
Okay.
3 years after his initial sentencing.
Potentially. So even with that date, it's not guaranteed.
Right, yeah. There are still specific conditions that have to be met. For instance, anyone hoping for early termination has to have paid, like, all required restitution, can't have had their probation revoked, and can't have been arrested for anything new.
Right.
Aside from maybe, like, minor traffic violations.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
You got to prove that you're serious.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so assuming Clark met all those conditions back in 2021, what happened next? Did he get that early termination?
So this is where it gets really interesting and frustrating. This is where the Department of Community Supervision, or DCS, comes in.
Okay.
They're the ones responsible for supervising people on probation.
Right.
And critically, they're required by law to notify the court and the prosecuting attorney, if someone meets all the criteria for early termination. So it's like they raise a flag and say, hey, this person's doing well, they deserve consideration.
Right. So did they raise that flag for Clark?
That's the thing. They didn't. DCS totally missed their deadline to notify the court.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah.
They just forgot.
I mean, we don't know exactly why they didn't follow through,
Right.
but the fact is they didn't notify the court about Clark's, potential eligibility for early termination.
But what happened when this came out, this oversight?
So the case went to the Court of Appeals, and initially they ruled that the DCS notification, it wasn't strictly mandatory. They used the legal term directory, which basically means, it's more like a guideline than an absolute rule.
So the Court of Appeals was saying, even though DCS should have notified the court, it wasn't a deal breaker.
Yeah, that was their initial interpretation.
Right.
But hold on, because this is where the Georgia Supreme Court steps in, right?
Yeah.
And things take another turn. They disagreed with the Court of Appeals. They said, no. This notification from DCS, mandatory.
Okay, so that sounds like a win for Clark, right? Case closed, he's off probation.
Oh, unfortunately, no, it's not that simple.
Okay.
Even though the Supreme Court, said, hey, DCS, you have a legal obligation to notify the court.
Right.
that doesn't automatically mean probation's terminated if they mess up.
So even if the system made a mistake, Clark's not just automatically off the hook.
Exactly. The court still gets to decide, and they have to consider what's called the best interest of justice and the welfare of society.
Right.
So that means they're weighing a lot of factors to decide whether, ending probation is the right decision, even if, all the technical requirements weren't met.
So it's not just about, like, did they do the paperwork right?
Right.
It's about, does the court think this is, like, the best call for everyone?
Exactly. It's a complex decision, and this case shows how much, power the court has in these situations.
Okay, but that phrase, best interests of justice and the welfare of society, like, that's pretty broad. What kinds of things would the court even look at to make this decision?
Well, they'd probably look at Clark's behavior, since he was convicted.
Right.
Like, has he really been rehabilitated?
Okay.
Have there been any, red flags, any signs that, if he's released, he might be a risk?
Mm-hmm.
They also consider, what were his original crimes like?
Right.
The impact on the victims, and just, the overall safety of the community.
So even though, like, technically Clark met all the requirements for early termination, the court could still say no based on, like, these other things.
That's right. It's not just, checking boxes,
Right.
It's about looking at everything and, making a judgment call about what's best for everyone.
And in Clark's case, what did they decide? Did they give him early termination?
Unfortunately, no. The court ultimately denied his motion.
Wow. So even after all that, even with the Supreme Court, like, ruling in his favor about the notification,
Yeah.
he still ended up, like, stuck on probation.
Yes, and this is where the case, gets really heartbreaking,
Yeah.
Because it just shows how, these procedural errors,
Right.
they have, real consequences, for people.
Yeah, it's like he did everything right. He jumped through all the hoops, but the system still kind of failed him.
And this is why this case has, sparked so much discussion. It raises, serious questions about fairness and accountability and the potential for these kinds of, oversights
Yeah.
to, trap people in the system.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how many other people are out there that are stuck on probation longer than they should be
Right.
because somebody missed a deadline or.
That's the scary part, right?
Yeah.
We just don't know. We don't know how widespread this issue is.
Right.
It's possible there are many others who, have been negatively impacted by similar oversights.
So what happens now? Like, will this ruling change anything? Will it force the DCS to, like, do these notifications better?
Well, it certainly should. I mean, this case has really exposed, a flaw in the system, right?
Got it.
A gap where people can fall through the cracks. So hopefully it'll be like a wake-up call for DCS.
Right.
Make them review their procedures, and really try to prevent this from happening again.
It seems like the least they could do.
Absolutely. And beyond that, maybe this case could lead to even bigger reforms.
Okay.
Maybe there needs to be a clearer process for, addressing these kinds of errors. A way for people to, appeal or seek some kind of, justice if they've been wrongly kept on probation.
Like the system needs, like, a safety net.
Exactly. This case really highlights the need for more accountability within the justice system.
Right.
Not just for individuals, but for the institutions themselves.
And it brings up that question, like, what does it really mean to serve justice?
Right.
Is it just about following the rules, or is it about making sure things are fair?
That's a deep question.
Yeah.
And this case makes us think about it. It reminds us that the justice system is more than just, rules and procedures.
Right.
It's about people's lives.
And sometimes those rules and procedures can actually, like, get in the way of justice.
Absolutely. Sometimes trying to be so orderly can lead to things that are, just not fair.
Yeah, like Clark's case, right? He did everything right, but he still ends up, dealing with the system's mistake.
Exactly. And that's why cases like this are so important. They make us examine our systems,
Yeah.
question our assumptions and push for changes that are, really going to promote justice and fairness.
This deep dive has been, like, really eye-opening. It's shown us how a little procedural thing can have, like, these huge ripple effects.
Absolutely.
That impact people's lives in ways we don't even realize.
It's a reminder that the legal system, with all its complexities, it's ultimately about people.
Yeah.
And when those complexities lead to outcomes that are not just,
Yeah.
we have to speak up and say, hey, we need to do better.
It makes you think, like, what does this mean for other people? Like, is this going to change anything for people on probation in Georgia?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Like, will this case actually lead to change? We've shined a light on a problem.
You'd hope so, right? It seems like the least they could do is make sure that, DCS is following the law, when it comes to these notifications.
Absolutely, yeah. At the very least, DCS needs to like re-examine what they're doing, right? Maybe put some new things in place so they don't miss deadlines, protect people's rights.
What about the people who this has already, like, affected? Like, the people who might have been kept on probation too long because of this, you know? Is there anything they can do?
That's a really good question, and it's a tough one. It's possible that because of this ruling, there could be some legal challenges, maybe even a class action lawsuit for the people who are like negatively affected.
Yeah, it seems like it would be hard, but it would be a way to, like, fix things, right? And hold the system accountable.
For sure. And even bigger than individual cases, maybe this could lead to lawmakers changing the law. Like making it super clear how probation termination works, or like making it easier to fix these, procedural errors.
So it's like the whole system, like, needs to be looked at. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's definitely something we need to talk about. This case shows that, like, even if a law is meant to do good,
Right.
there can be consequences we didn't expect.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, those consequences hurt the people the system was supposed to help.
That's messed up. It's a good reminder that we can't just assume everything's working fine, you know?
Right.
We gotta, like, pay attention, ask questions, and, demand better when things go wrong.
I totally agree. And that's why it's so important for everyone to understand their rights,
Right.
and get involved in these issues. Because at the end of the day, the justice system belongs to all of us.
Yeah.
We got to make sure it's, fair and doing what it's supposed to do.
This deep dive has been, like, crazy.
Yeah.
It showed us how, like, something that seems so small
Right.
can make things so complicated.
It's true. The law is more than just like ideas, It affects real people's lives,
Totally.
for
Yeah.
good or bad.
And that's a good point to leave our learners with, I think. Like, justice, it's not just one thing, it's something we got to keep working on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep thinking about these questions and, pay attention to what's happening with the law.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for having me.
It makes you wonder, like, what's next? Like, what does this mean for the future?
Right, right.
Is this going to change anything for other people on probation, in Georgia?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? I mean, this case it's definitely showed us like a weak spot
Right.
in the system.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see if it actually like leads to some real change.
I hope so. I mean, it seems like at the very least they should make sure that, the Department of Community Supervision, like, that they're actually following the law,
Right, right.
when it comes to these notifications.
Yeah, absolutely. Like at a minimum,
Yeah.
DCS should be taking a good hard look at how they do things.
Right.
Maybe put some new checks in place.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they don't miss those deadlines. It's all about protecting people's rights,
What about people who've already been affected by this? Like the people who might have stayed on probation longer than they should have
Right.
because of these mistakes. Is there anything they can do?
That's a tough one. It's possible that this ruling,
Yeah.
it might open the door for some legal challenges.
Okay.
Maybe even like a class action lawsuit
Right.
for the people who are like really hurt by this.
It wouldn't be easy.
Right.
But it would be a way to, like, make things right.
Exactly,
And
yeah.
hold the system accountable.
And beyond, like individual cases,
Yeah.
maybe this ruling could lead to some bigger changes in the law.
Okay.
Like maybe lawmakers will decide to like make the rules about probation termination, super clear.
Right. Right.
Or maybe they'll come up with a better process, for fixing these procedural errors.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like the whole system needs to be looked at, kinda.
Yeah. This case really shows us that even when a law has good intentions, right?
Right.
There could be consequences we didn't think about.
Right. Right.
And sometimes those consequences hurt the people that this was supposed to help in the first place.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's a good reminder that we can't just assume that the system is always working perfectly, right?
Absolutely.
We got to, like, pay attention, ask questions, and demand better when things are messed up.
I couldn't agree more. And that's why it's so important for everyone to understand like what their rights are.
Right.
Get involved, in these issues, because ultimately, like the justice system, it belongs to all of us, right?
Yeah.
We have to make sure it's being fair and doing what it's supposed to do.
This has been like a wild ride,
Yeah.
this deep dive. It's shown us how something so small can make things so complicated.
It's true. The law, it's more than just like these abstract principles. It's about people
Right.
and how it affects their lives, good or bad.
I think that's a really good point to leave our listeners with, you know. Justice, it's not just a destination, it's a journey, right? And we all got to be a part of it. So, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope that you keep thinking about these questions and stay involved with, everything that's going on with the law and the justice system.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.